Around 300 witnesses are set to testify in this trial over the coming months. One of them is former French President François Hollande. Now, he was present at the Stade de France when 3 suicide bombers struck as an international football match was underway. He later declared a nationwide state of emergency. Here he is speaking a short while ago, recalling the events of that night.
I was getting reports almost minute by minute, and there was no doubt about the scale of the attack. I realized that this was not an isolated act of one or more terrorists blowing themselves up outside a stadium or at a pavement cafe. This was an operation by several commandos and an act of war. I thought of all the victims. I'm a father myself. We all knew the districts and the places being attacked. I thought of all the men and women of all nationalities who were hit and who the terrorists were targeting right to the end to kill.
Now, Doug, France, of course, changed dramatically that night, not just psychologically, but also legally, starting with that state of emergency. In recent years, French authorities have introduced a number of restrictions on our civil liberties. Have we got more used to those restrictions in recent years?
Well, look, not to get alarmist here, the French we're not living in a national security state. We're not living in a police state yet, despite some claims to the contrary on some parts of the political spectrum. That said, sure, there has been a trend towards greater acceptance or acquiescence, if you will, to restrictions on civil liberties. And that's not to say that people have just sort of, bowed down to these new states of emergencies and gone quietly into the night. There's obviously been protests from a lot of civil liberties advocates in other parts of French society. But there's also been a heightened sense, reinforced by these attacks, of both fear and suspicion. And not in a vacuum. Fear and suspicion, let's say it for what it is, of France's disproportionately large to many French Muslim community. And the problem here is that fear and suspicion has been sort of a vicious circle. It's fed this cycle of state of emergency. As François Hollande, who we just saw there, he declared the first state of emergency shortly before midnight on the night of the attacks. We have seen several iterations of those states of emergency since. Emmanuel Macron, so Hollande continued them. Emmanuel Macron codified the state of emergency into law. And just last month, in August, we had the Constitutional Council, which is almost like the equivalent of the Supreme Court in France, basically approving a new iteration of the state of emergency, which is becoming almost semi-permanent in French society, applying to prisoners, to convicts who've served out their sentences, who will now be subject to certain additional obligations, even though they've served out their terms. In the United States, it's often called double jeopardy, because they said, well, you served your time. Why should you still be subject to some sort of punishment? Aren't you sort of free now? Not necessarily under these new iterations of the law. Look, there are a lot of people right now in France who are being monitored by the French intelligence and security services. It's called Fichier S. There are over 7,500 of these individuals. They're seen as people who are liable or prone to becoming, quote, radicalized. Radicalized meaning not just people who would operate in a terror cell, but people who are just lone wolves who could be inspired by something they've read or seen on the internet, have heard things in jail, perhaps very radical or extremist rhetoric, Islamist rhetoric. These are the people that the French are worried about, that the French security services are worried about right now. But I will note, just to say that you asked, are things more secure in France right now? Have the state of emergencies worked? Obviously, you can't airtight ensure protection against future terror attacks, but what you can do is thwart a lot of attacks. And there have been, by some estimates, about 35, 36 attacks thwarted since in recent years, since 2015. Attacks we'll never hear about and never know about because of the extra measures taken and the stepped-up security measures.
And Vivienne, do you think that French people are, as Doug suggested, more reassured now than they were in the immediate aftermath of those attacks?
I mean, no doubt. 6 years is a long time. And I think for a lot of Parisians, they have gotten used to a certain level of security. And it has been, for most people, fairly reassuring. I think it's reassuring to people that the government appears to have its focus on people that it might want to be worried about. Whereas in 2013, it didn't really. Don't forget, the Paris attacks, that's what we call the November 13th attacks, It came many months after the Charlie Hebdo attacks. I mean, Charlie Hebdo was an incredibly shocking event. It brought 1 million people out onto the streets of Paris. Leaders from all over the world came to Paris with one message, that this would never happen again. 10 months later, it did happen again, and worse. So people do need a level of reassurance. I think despite the concerns of civil libertarians, it has given people a level of reassurance, and that's essential for a capital city, a major economic power like Paris.